Hi, so with the apparently easy curve in Mythic and Taurus, attention has turned to class stacking. Now, first of all, what's been going on and why is this? Well, what happened was on the first day of Mythic and Taurus release, limits, the main North American guild, got to 9 out of 11. The next day, when the European realms opened, Method and Exorcist raced to 10 out of 11. Limit followed them shortly afterwards. And now everyone's stuck on Argus. At the point at which I'm doing this, Mythic Argus the Unmaker is still alive, and there are at least 12 guilds who are now up to that point. So 2 guilds that were able to get up to Argus within 1 day, 5 days later still have not got the final boss. Now that could be an example of Blizzard panicking with the ease with which the first 10 were knocked over and reactively buffing the last boss to make it almost impossible, if not actually impossible, or it may be something else. But it's mostly the other boss we're going to look at. Now, just because it was a very easy curve for the top guilds doesn't necessarily mean it will be for everyone, even relatively speaking. Now, what I'm talking about here is the potential for class stacking. So sometimes you have a fight that has, on Mythic level, a number of difficult abilities. These are the things that are going to slow your progress down. But certain classes may allow you to either make those mechanics much easier or even ignore them altogether. So if you're able to take lots of that class, then you will get past that fight very easily. If you're not able to take much of that class, if anything, then you're going to have a really tough time. And it's not just about the ease with which top guilds do it. This can affect guilds much lower down. Your world rank position, with everything else being equal, might vary by quite a lot, potentially hundreds of ranks, because one tier maybe you had a really good roster for the fights, the next tier that same roster isn't so good. Example of this would, coming back from Wars of Draenor, most keenly felt in the guild I was in at the time, the last 2 bosses in Blackrock Foundry, so Mythic Iron Maidens, then Mythic Blackhand. So Mythic Iron Maidens, we had 2 shield tanks at the time, a warrior and a paladin. And we were getting there, but we were making slow progress on Iron Maidens. Now, at the time we decided, okay, what we'd really want here is a Brewmaster. A Brewmaster monk would have completely ignored one of the really nasty mechanics right at the end of the fight. So we geared that Brewmaster up, took the Brewmaster, fight went over straight away. No problem at all, it took hardly any pulse. Same with Mythic Blackhand. If we'd have been using the Protection Paladin and the Protection Warrior for that fight, that would have been a lot more difficult. We were able to use the Brewmaster Monk for that fight as well. That helped us basically ignore a very difficult mechanic, and that meant we could kill that boss much more quickly. Guilds without that facility would have had a tougher time of it. So what is it that will encourage class stacking? So there are 3 main things that come to mind. The first is powerful buffs. So if there's one particular class that brings a fairly unique buff and you want lots of it, you benefit from having lots of it, then of course you want to take lots of that class. That is less of an issue at the moment, but it may become an issue later on in the next expansion. A classic example of this is back from Burning Crusade with Shamans. Shamans had the Wind Fury Totem. You were able to move players around in groups, even in combat as well at the time, so you could keep moving the Shaman around to drop their Wind Fury Totem and provide a buff to that particular party, a very powerful DPS cooldown effectively. Battle for Azeroth, it may rear its head a little bit again because all classes are getting special buffs again. Some of these are passive auras, which means you're not necessarily going to benefit from having more than one of that class. Some of them are not. Some of them are on-use abilities that last a short amount of time, so it seems at the moment. That might mean you want to stack some of the classes that have particularly useful buffs. But that's more for the next expansion. We don't know exactly how that's going to pan out. At the moment, doesn't happen so much. Buffs tend to be the preserve mostly of healers. The raid cooldown buffs, heroism is the main one, and there's multiple classes that can bring that, and you don't need a lot of people to be able to bring that either. So we don't have a particular problem with that. So there's 2 main reasons for class stacking that we have at the moment in Legion. So the next one is immunities. So the use of immunities to either solo soak, a mechanic that's intended to have multiple people in it, or just to ignore a mechanic in general. So examples of this, recent examples with Fallen Avatar classic case here, where if you had a class that was able to not just immune the touch of Sargeras, because lots of classes could immune it, but very few classes would be able to do it every single time. Now, in a situation like that, if there's a particular class that's super good at doing that, then you want to take multiple of that class. Now, what could be done about that? The only thing you could really do about that is either to make everyone's immunity, not everyone has an immunity in the normal sense. So paladins, for example, get an immunity that covers magical and physical damage. Rogues get an immunity that covers sort of magical damage, which covers most things because there's very few fatal physical damage attacks. Some people get ones that will cover physical damage, things like that. Everyone who has those sort of abilities, the only way to deal with this is to put it on the same cooldown, because usually what the issue is with some classes, the cooldown is so long that it doesn't allow them to deal with everyone. Some of those classes have it on such a short cooldown that they can do every single one, and there's where the issue is. So the only way to do that is, without making the abilities homogeneous, Blizzard are very keen to have individual classes having their own unique abilities, which is absolutely fine. The only way to do that is to have some classes have one that just does spell damage, some physical, some a bit of both, maybe a smaller amount of both, but for everyone to have it on the same cooldown, so it lasts the same amount of time. So if one person can do every single one, well then so can that person, and so can that person, and so can that person. That way you don't have to class stack as much, because there will be multiple classes that can do the same thing that a normal balanced roster might reasonably have. Because that's what we're talking about with class stacking. We're talking about the normal balanced raid roster of a typical Mythic raiding guild wouldn't be able to do that. That's what class stacking is, when you wouldn't be able to do that. So the last one, the real crucial one in Antorus, the one that's reared its ugly head, so to speak. This is the reason why on Mythic Coven, for example, you've got a load of Warlocks and Shadow Priests being taken, is multi-dotting. Multi-dotting is a really awkward situation because it's not easy to deal with it if it's going to be in the game at all. The situation with multi-dotting is this. On a boss that is only one boss and there's no adds at all, these same classes have to be able to do decent single target damage. So we need Warlocks and Shadow Priests to be able to do good damage so that they are competitive. As soon as you introduce a situation where there's a few adds that you're going to blow up, all right, well, the multi-dotters don't really get a lot of benefit from that because the adds are going to die quickly. So then create a situation where you're going to have multiple bosses, whether it's a council fight or they are just separate bosses, or there's going to be adds up for a very long time. In a situation like that, the multi-dotters are going to suddenly have their damage go very high, because they're not only getting extra damage from those dots. Usually the way those classes work is those dots, when they tick, have a chance to generate resources as well, which increases their single target damage. That's why when there are adds of low priority, you're told not to DPS them, not just because it's not doing any good, but because the multi-dotters are losing single target damage out of it. So how can we deal with this problem? Because on a fight like Coven, for example, where you've got multiple adds up and they're going to be up for a long time, in this particular case, or fight, then you are going to see those classes suddenly doing way more damage. And if you've got the ability to have multiple of those in your roster, you're going to get through that fight a lot more quickly than a guild that has just one or two of them. And the answer to this is, again, simple, and whether it's worth doing is another matter, and that is you don't have multi-dotting. So those same classes with those same abilities, the only way to deal with it is for that spell, if you have it on one target and then you apply the same dot to another target, it cancels it off the first target. In other words, it becomes impossible to multi-dot. In a situation like that, of course, you have to give them extra abilities so that they can still compete in AoE. Otherwise, then that's not fair. But that is the only way to deal with it. And that is why class stacking, unless there is a conscious decision to change it, which I don't think there is, these things will still occur. Now, for top guilds, as I say, it's not a big deal for top guilds because they have the ability to take these classes. It mostly affects guilds lower down, but thinking about it from Blizzard's point of view, for every guild that's going to be unhappy about it because for that particular tier, their roster doesn't allow them to ignore the super difficult mechanics, because this only matters on the tough bosses, by the way. This doesn't matter on the easy bosses. Sometimes there are particular classes, oh, that's really good for Grothy Willbreaker. Who cares? It's going to die with whatever roster you've got. It's the really tough bosses, the roadblock bosses, so Imanar a little bit, Coven, Agrimar, Argus. The classes that can really shine on those are going to be the ones you want several of in your roster. So for every guild that looks at the tier and goes, oh, well, we don't have a lot of that, we're going to struggle, There's another guild that does and will leapfrog ahead. So from Blizzard's point of view, there isn't an imbalance of people who are unhappy about it, because as many people lose out on that will gain from it as well. So I don't think there's anything that's going to be done about it. But hopefully that just explains a little bit about why it's possible for guilds who can get whatever roster they need for a given boss to steamroll through bosses that could still present a certain amount of challenge for other guilds. So I don't want people feeling at this point, when we're only 1 week in, that Mythic and Taurus is a joke compared to, say, Mythic Tomb of Sargeras. It may not turn out to be that way. It may well be that for the mere mortal guilds, that actually there is genuine challenge still to come, even though the first few bosses... I mean, the very first few bosses, I would say, were more difficult than the very first few bosses of Tomb of Sargeras. That's my personal impression at the moment, without a lot of experience of it, I have to say. But in terms of the time it's taking some guilds to kill literally the first 3 bosses, it seems to be taking a little bit longer than it did in Tomb. The next few bosses, okay, that seems to be happening a bit quicker. So, but maybe, you know, given that it's an extra couple of bosses and there are some tough bosses towards the end, we might actually see people still defeating Mythic and Taurus in roughly the same amount of time that they defeated Mythic Tomb of Sargeras. And more especially, what might be a better measure is Mythic Nighthold, because in actual fact Mythic Tomb of Sargeras was a particularly tough one in there as well. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, don't forget to give it a like. Comments down below, they're always interesting. First time to my channel, don't forget to subscribe, please. Share it with other people who might be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later and have fun in Antorus.